Picture this. Harlan Voss, 58 years old with a mortgage to think about, stands at the polished doors of Thorn Dynamics while the CFO points at the street and says it plain. We need team players, not auditors. Marcus Hale had no idea the man he just turned away was the only one who saw exactly how the Arrow Link numbers would unravel the whole company. Harlan walked out that day, carrying nothing but his satchel. Yet the deal Marcus wanted so badly never went through. The question is how one set of eyes caught what the rest of the building missed. Harlan had been out of work 4 months by then. The old aviation safety firm had let the whole compliance unit go after the last contract dried up, and he'd spent every morning since updating resumes that never got answered. The Thorn interview was the one that mattered. Director of Compliance came with a salary that would cover the house and leave something for savings, maybe even a buffer for the months ahead. He'd pressed his one good suit the night before and tied his tie twice in the mirror. Inside the glass tower, the receptionist sent him up to the 14th floor. Harlan waited in a narrow alcove and noticed the open file on the low table. Skybridge acquisition, Arrow Link assets, stamped confidential. He read the summary page while he waited. The lease obligations listed didn't match the tail numbers on the engines, and 2 of the aircraft showed flight hours that couldn't have been flown if they'd been pulled for overhaul 2 years earlier. He closed the folder when the assistant called his name. Marcus Hale met him in a corner office with city light coming through the blinds. The CFO laid out the job in 5 minutes. Review every new acquisition, sign off fast, keep the board happy. Then he slid the Arrow Link summary across the desk and asked for Harlan's initial on the compliance sheet. Harlan picked up the pen, set it down again, and said the numbers didn't hold. He asked for the full lease appendix and the maintenance logs. Marcus told him they were on the server. Harlan pulled the chair closer, worked through the columns line by line, and wrote a single rejection memo citing the hidden debts and the duplicated engine entries. When he pushed the paper back, Marcus looked at him like he'd tracked mud on the carpet. We need team players, not auditors, Marcus said, and that was the end of the interview. Harlan gathered his satchel, rode the elevator down, and stepped into the revolving doors. He didn't notice the barefoot woman who came running through the lobby behind him until she called his name twice. Harlan turned at the sound of his name, and there she stood, mid-30s, maybe hair pulled back too tight, one shoe missing, holding the other in her hand like it had betrayed her. Mr. Harlan, she said again, breathless. Marcus sent me after you. He wants another word. You could see the lobby lights catching the worry on her face, and Harlan felt that old pull in his chest, the one he'd learned to ignore years ago. He glanced at the revolving doors, then back at her. He made himself pretty clear upstairs, he said. She shook her head. It's not about the job. Please, just come back to the 14th floor for 5 minutes. She looked down at her bare foot and added, almost to herself, I kicked the heel off in the elevator, try and catch you. They rode up together in silence. Harlan kept his satchel close, the same one he carried through 2 decades of hangar inspections and late-night calls from creditors who didn't know his real name. Inside, tucked behind the spare tie, was the thing he never left home without, that small brass compass his father had given him the day he earned his first private pilot certificate. The needle still swung true, even now. He touched the edge of it through the canvas and tried not to think about how many times that compass had pointed him toward trouble he could have walked away from. Marcus was waiting in the same corner office, but the blinds were drawn tighter and the Arrow Link file was open again. The CFO didn't apologize for the earlier brush-off. He just pointed at the rejection memo Harlan had left behind. You caught something the rest of the team missed, Marcus said. The duplicated engine hours. We need you to walk us through exactly where those numbers came from. Harlan stayed on his feet. You told me you needed team players. I need the truth more, Marcus answered. He slid a second folder across the desk. This one thicker, marked with the Thorn logo and a date from 3 years back. You used to consult on the Arrow Link account before the bankruptcy filing, didn't you? Under a different firm name. The question landed soft, but Harlan felt the floor shift anyway. He hadn't expected Marcus to dig that far, not this fast. He opened the folder anyway, because refusing would only raise more questions, and pointed to a line item on page 3. These maintenance invoices were never paid to the actual vendor. The money went into a shell account in the Caymans. Whoever signed them off knew the planes weren't airworthy. Marcus rubbed his jaw. "And you're sure about this because I wrote the original report the F8 and never saw," Harlan said quietly. "And because I paid the first round of mechanics out of my own pocket so those aircraft could stay grounded instead of killing somebody." The CFO sat back. For a moment, neither man spoke. Down the hall, a phone rang unanswered, and the barefoot assistant, her name turned out to be Lena, slipped back in with 2 cups of coffee and set them down without a word. Harlan noticed she'd found her other shoe. Marcus tapped the memo again. "If I bring this to the board tonight, the whole acquisition collapses. My bonus vanishes. My daughter's tuition check bounces. You understand what you're asking?" "I'm not asking anything," Harlan said. "I'm telling you what the logs say. What you do with it is your business." He stood to leave once more, and that's when the phone on Marcus's desk lit up with an internal call. Lena answered it, listened, then covered the mouthpiece. "Security says there's a reporter in the lobby asking about Aerolink. Says he got an anonymous tip about hidden liabilities." Marcus looked at Harlan. "You didn't?" "No," Harlan said. The compass in his satchel felt heavier than it had any right to. He thought of the months ahead, counting on a paycheck that hadn't arrived yet. He thought of the 3 previous times he'd quietly stepped in, once wiring the exact amount to cover Marcus's missed alimony payment 2 years earlier, once making sure the right inspector showed up before a different fleet was grounded, once mailing an unsigned envelope with the name of a better lawyer when Marcus's divorce turned ugly. None of it had ever been about gratitude. Marcus stood too. "If that reporter prints before we verify, the stock drops 20 points by morning. I need you to stay and look at the rest of these logs." His voice had lost its edge. "Please." Harlan didn't answer right away. He reached into the satchel, touched the compass once more for the steadiness of it, then set the satchel on the chair. "1 hour," he said. "And I want those full tail numbers, not the summary you gave me the first time." Out in the hallway, Lena was already clearing a desk for him. She caught his eye for just a second and gave the smallest nod, like she'd seen this kind of quiet bargain before. Harlan sat down, opened the thicker folder, and the work began again. No fanfare, no promises, just the steady scratch of a pen moving across paper that would either save the company or bury it. The brass compass stayed in the satchel at his feet, its needle pointing north like it always had, steady while the building around them kept turning. Harlan worked without looking up for the first 40 minutes, the kind of silence that used to fill the old dispatch office back when Aerolink still ran its own hulls instead of leasing them out. You could hear the building settling around them, the low hum of the air handlers, the occasional ring of a phone 2 offices down, Lena's heels when she stepped out to fetch more coffee. Every so often Marcus would lean over the desk and ask a question that showed he hadn't looked at the raw numbers in years. Harlan would answer with the tail number first, then the date, then the exact discrepancy, the same way he used to read weather reports over the radio at 3 a.m. when the storms were moving faster than the forecasts. The compass stayed where it was, inside the satchel, but Harlan's shoe rested against the leather now and then, just enough to feel the metal edge through the canvas. He thought about the day Ellie's mother had given it to him, 43 years ago on a layover in Denver, before any of the kids were born, before the routes got sold off one by one. The needle still pointed true. Some things didn't need updating. At the 50-minute mark, a new folder came down from the legal floor. Lena set it in front of him without a word. Harlan opened it, and the first page stopped him cold. A maintenance log from 2017, signed by a young inspector who'd since left the company, documenting a hydraulic pressure test that had never actually been run. The numbers looked familiar because Harlan had quietly arranged for the right man to come in that same week and ground the aircraft before it left the hangar. Marcus didn't know that part. Harlan had paid the inspectors overtime out of his own account and mailed the receipt to an old post office box so it wouldn't trace back. Marcus read over his shoulder. That can't be right. We had the FAA sign off 2 days later. You had a signature, Harlan said. Not the same thing. He tapped the page. The test sheet was backdated. The bird should have been in the shop another 72 hours. Marcus went pale. If that gets out with the reporter downstairs. That's the thing about reporters, Harlan said, still calm. They don't always know which document to ask for next. He closed the folder. But somebody will once they start digging. The phone rang again. Lena answered, and this time her face changed before she covered the mouthpiece. It's the tower at Midway. They're holding Flight 442 because the load sheet doesn't match the fuel ticket. The first officer says the numbers were swapped at the gate. Marcus looked at Harlan the way a man looks at the last working flashlight in a blackout. Can you? Harlan reached for the satchel, found the compass without opening it, and left his hand there a moment. I need the current manifest and the fuel vendor contract from last quarter. Not the summary, the actual pages. While Lena copied the files, Harlan stood and stepped into the hallway for a breath of air that wasn't recycled. The compass weight in the satchel reminded him of the 3 quiet moves he'd already made this year. Paying the union steward to keep quiet about a pension shortfall, slipping the name of a retired mechanic into a hiring folder so the night shift wouldn't lose its only man who could still read a Pratt & Whitney log without a manual, wiring Ellie's last tuition payment when Marcus's signature had been delayed 3 weeks. None of it had bought him a seat at the table. That wasn't the point. Back at the desk, the work stretched into the second hour. The reporter was still in the lobby. Security called up twice to say he'd received another anonymous email, this one with a scanned invoice that mentioned an old FAA case, number Harlan remembered all too well. The case had been settled quietly because Harlan had found the original test pilot's handwritten notes in a storage unit the company had forgotten to clear. He hadn't kept copies for himself. He'd simply made sure the notes reached the right desk before the fine turned into a grounding order. Marcus watched him work now instead of interrupting. At one point he said, almost under his breath, I told you to take your box and go this morning. Harlan didn't answer. He just circled another discrepancy on the page and wrote the correct figure in the margin the way he used to log wind drift on paper charts when the GPS was still new and unreliable. The phone rang a third time. Lena listened, then held the receiver out to Harlan. It's for you. The man downstairs says he got your name from someone on the loading crew. Harlan took the call standing. He listened for 30 seconds, said 4 words, checked the 2017 hydraulic file, and hung up. When he sat back down, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Marcus started to speak, stopped, then tried again. How did he even know to ask about 2017? Harlan touched the satchel once more with the toe of his shoe. The needle inside stayed pointed north, steady as ever, while the rest of the building kept turning. Harlan kept his eyes on the pages in front of him, the same way he'd kept them on a checklist during a crosswind landing back when he still flew the line. The compass needle didn't move. You could almost feel the room trying to decide what to make of a man who still showed up with a satchel that belonged in a museum. Marcus shifted in his chair like the leather had grown hotter. Lena poured another cup of coffee she didn't drink. The reporter called up again, this time asking for Marcus by name. Harlan didn't look up, but he heard the edge in Marcus's voice when he told security to send the man away. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody downstairs knew, was that Harlan had already mailed the reporter a single photograph 3 weeks earlier. A 2014 inspection log with Marcus's own initials on the line that cleared the hydraulic reroute everybody later pretended had been routine. Harlan never signed it himself. He just made sure the original stayed in the file, instead of disappearing into the shredder the way the new safety director wanted. A fresh problem arrived at 3:17. The loading crew radioed up that a shipment of actuators for the midnight overhaul had been rejected at the dock. Wrong spec, wrong lot number. Marcus reached for the phone, then stopped because the only person who could sign off on an emergency substitute was the same retired inspector whose name had been taken off the approved list 6 months ago. Harlan waited. He let the silence stretch until Lena finally asked, soft, "You still know the guy at the supplier, don't you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he nudged the satchel with his foot until the needles settled again, that steady north it had held since the day his wife gave it to him, the morning he left for the last overhaul he ever flew. The needle had pointed true through 2 divorces, 3 bankruptcies in the family, and every layoff notice the company ever printed. It pointed true now while Marcus watched him. Harlan picked up the phone, asked for the supplier's night manager by first name, and said only that the lot number on the manifest matched the one pulled from the 2019 recall. The manager on the other end went quiet for a long second, then promised the correct actuators would be on a truck inside the hour. No names exchanged. No thanks asked. Harlan hung up and went back to the discrepancy sheet like nothing had happened. Marcus's hands were flat on the table now. "That recall never went public," he said. "Some things don't need to," Harlan answered. The words came out quiet, the same tone he'd used the night he'd walked the floor after the 2008 fire and told every second shift man to go home to his kids while the Union Hall still had hot coffee and cots. A new voice cut through the intercom. Ellie, Marcus's daughter, calling from the road. Her car had thrown a rod 2 counties over, and the only garage open this late wanted $300 just to look at it. Marcus started to stand, then remembered his own wallet was at the office because the morning meeting had gone long and ugly. Harlan reached into the satchel without looking, pulled out an envelope already addressed to the garage's night desk, and slid it across the table. Inside was a note in his careful block letters and enough cash to cover the tow plus a loaner. The envelope had Lena's address on it, not his. Marcus stared at the handwriting like it had rearranged the whole office. Ellie would never know whose cash had kept her from sleeping in the car. Marcus would, though. The compass kept pointing while the building settled into the long middle of the night, and the only sound left was the scratch of Harlan's pencil correcting one more line that had been wrong since before any of them had sat down. Marcus rubbed his eyes and tried to shake it off, but the envelope stayed right there on the table, corners squared like it had always belonged. You could see the questions stacking up behind his face. 40 years at the plant, they used to say, and Harlan had outlasted every one of them without ever asking for the corner office or the nameplate. What kind of man keeps an address for his ex-wife's garage just in case her son-in-law's daughter breaks down on a Tuesday night? The phone rang again before Marcus could put the pieces together. This time it was the loading dock foreman, voice tight, saying the overnight freight had come back short 3 pallets, and the bill of lading carried a signature nobody recognized. The customer on the other end was already threatening to pull the whole contract if the shortage wasn't square by morning. Marcus started reaching for his keys again, but Harlan was already standing, compass clicking shut in his palm like a period at the end of a sentence. "Sit," Harlan said, not sharp, just the same steady tone he'd used when a union vote went sideways in '97 and half the floor was ready to walk. He picked up the manifest, ran a finger down the lot numbers, and stopped at the one that shouldn't have been there. That's the old code from the Cleveland warehouse before they renumbered everything in 2014. Somebody copied the wrong sheet. He dialed without checking the book, asked for a night clerk whose name Marcus had never heard, and read the numbers off in that same quiet voice. The clerk on the line went still, then came back with the corrected count and an apology that sounded like it came from the top of the company. No raised words, no credit taken. Harlan set the receiver down and went back to his pencil like the room had never changed. Marcus watched the compass disappear into the satchel again. "You weren't even on the dock roster in 2014, he said. "Some things get handled after the roster stops," Harlan answered. The pause stretched long enough for the fluorescent light above them to flicker once, then settle. Outside, the first gray of morning was starting to press against the high windows, but the building still felt like midnight. Marcus's shoulders had dropped half an inch without him noticing. Ellie's car was already on the road with a loaner that would get her home before her shift at the hospital, and the actuators were rolling toward the line on a truck that wouldn't be late. The only thing left hanging was that one line on the discrepancy sheet Harlan kept erasing and rewriting, the same line that had been wrong since the last audit nobody wanted to open. Then the intercom crackled a third time. It was a night watchman this time, saying a state inspector had pulled into the lot early, paperwork in hand, asking why the safety logs from the East Wing renovation still showed the old violation codes from 2 years back. Marcus's face went tight again. Those codes were supposed to have been cleared when the new contractor signed off, but the contractor had gone under before the final report ever reached the file. One wrong stamp on that inspection, and the fines would land right on Marcus's desk with his name attached. He looked at Harlan like a man who had run out of places to look. Harlan didn't wait for the question. He opened the satchel, pulled out a single folded sheet of yellow carbon paper that smelled faintly of the old machine shop ink, and slid it across the table. The date on top read December 2021. The signature at the bottom was Marcus's own, but the witness line carried Harlan's block printing and a note about the extra bracing that had been added after hours. Marcus hadn't been in the building that weekend. He'd been at Lena's place helping with the roof after the ice storm. The compass came out once more, needle settling north like it had done every time the floor needed reminding which way was steady. Harlan set it beside the carbon sheet without a word. Marcus stared at both of them while the inspector's boots echoed down the hallway toward the office door. The watchman was already asking if they wanted the lights turned up. Harlan just waited. The way he'd waited through every other night, the plant had asked more of him than it ever put on a time card. The inspector walked in at 4:17, boots still shedding gravel from the lot, and he laid his clipboard on the table like he already knew the answer before he asked. Marcus stood up too fast. Harlan stayed seated. The man flipped through the state forms, tapped the old violation line with his pen, and said the East Wing would have to shut down for a full reinspection unless they could produce the corrected bracing report from December 2021. Marcus opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Harlan nudged the carbon sheet an inch closer. The inspector picked it up, read the date, ran his thumb over Marcus's signature, then stopped at the witness line where Harlan's block printing filled the margin with the exact measurements of the extra angle iron they'd added that weekend. He looked at Harlan. "You were here. Night shift," Harlan said. "Same as most nights when the day crew left the bracing short." The inspector initialed the form, stamped the page, and told them the file was cleared. He was gone before the coffee cooled. Marcus sat back down and stared at the compass still sitting on the table. "You kept that copy for 2 years. Figured somebody might need it again," Harlan said. He folded the carbon sheet once more and slid it back into the satchel. The night watchman killed the hallway lights. Outside, the first shift trucks were already idling at the gate. Marcus waited until the lot emptied. Then he asked Harlan to stay. They sat with the overheads off, just the emergency strip glowing above the door. Marcus's voice came out rough. "I told the owners last month you were dead weight, so we could cut the night watch and the old maintenance bench and nobody would notice." "You heard that?" "I heard," Harlan answered. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face. "I was wrong. You've been the only thing keeping this place from folding since Bill left. The logs, the actuator fix last spring, the permit renewal you walked over to county yourself. I never saw any of it until tonight." He stood, walked to the door, then turned back. "I am sorry, Harlan, for every time I walked past your bench like you weren't there." Harlan nodded once. The compass stayed on the table between them. 3 weeks later, the owners called the full quarterly meeting in the main conference room. Every foreman, every shift lead, every union steward. Marcus stood at the front with the safety report in his hand and told them the plant had passed without a single fine. Then he set the yellow carbon sheet under the projector so the whole room could read the witness line. "Harlan kept us straight when I didn't even know we were crooked," Marcus said. "He's worked here 37 years without asking for a single word of thanks. I'm giving him one now." He turned to the back row where Harlan sat in his usual chair. "I'm sorry for every time I looked through you. I won't do it again." The room stayed quiet a long moment. Then the oldest steward started clapping, slow, and the rest followed. Harlan didn't stand. He just gave the smallest nod and went back to turning the compass between his fingers. After the meeting, Lena came by the plant with a tin of cookies and a note from the grandkids. She found Harlan at his bench again, the same one he'd kept even after they tried to move him to the front office. She set the tin down and touched the compass where it sat beside the vise. "You always said this thing would point you home when nothing else would." "It still does," Harlan told her. Marcus kept his word. He started leaving the daily discrepancy sheet on Harlan's bench every evening with a carbon copy already filled out, asking for Harlan's initials before anything went upstairs. The plant passed its next 2 audits without a single question. Harlan stayed on nights. The owners offered him a title and a raise. He turned both down. 6 months later, the Union Hall put up a plaque with his name and the date of that December 2021 bracing job. Harlan never went to see it. He heard about it from the night watchman, who said Marcus had stood in front of the whole room again and read the old carbon sheet out loud one more time. Lena asked him once if he ever got tired of being the man. Nobody noticed until the roof started leaking. Harlan just tapped the compass with one finger. "Noticed or not," he said, "the floor still needs to know which way is north."